So our first question for all of the panelists, anyone can answer, no order, a determined order, I guess. How do your groups and your projects address inequity in schools, in our community, from an interdisciplinary approach?
I guess we could start it off. I'm from BGE again, and we kind of try to address the inequity in schools or in the community from an intersection between social impact and accessibility, whether that be accessibility to education or cultural understanding. And as we have mentioned in the past, some of the projects that we've done is we collaborated with a nationwide organization called New Colors, where we did a lot of tutoring that was based on bilingual tutoring. So not just tutoring in English and back and forth, but tutoring in the language that the student is comfortable with or that the student is most efficient in, such as if the student is an ESOL student that is mainly proficient in Spanish, then the tutoring session would happen in Spanish. And then Sophia, if you want to talk about a different project we did in the past.
So a current project we're actually working on is with AHEO. We partially mentioned it in our presentation. It's a storytelling project. So yeah, follow BGE for more updates. We're still in the works for that one.
Okay, I would say that our group addresses inequity in schools and in the community by when we see an issue happen at school or in our community, we base our meeting off of that topic, and then we provide a space for people to talk about it. If they were affected by it, they get support. They can hear that they're not alone because no one wants to be alone when something happens. And whether it happens on social media or on a Zoom, we always want to talk about it and make sure everyone's okay. And then for our projects, I would say that everything like relates back to like the same core values. So whenever we do like collab with a club or do like a toy drive, we always make sure that like it is helping our community and our schools. So yeah.
Yeah, so to answer the question for steps, like in addition to focusing on different issues around the county that affect students the most, steps also is really focused on being that gateway into helping more students get access to student advocacy. I think a lot of our members have talked about how steps is kind of their stepping stone into getting into student advocacy in Montgomery County. So we definitely, in addition to having working groups that work on several different issues, we also like to have meetings where we focus on different tips and tricks or different things that can help them improve their student advocacy or different tools that they can definitely use. So kind of targeting it from like different standpoints.
Thank you for those answers. When I think about advocacy in this county, I really think of it as a tapestry, and you all are filling such important niches. I'm just really building that quilt. So again, thanks for everything you're doing. The next question, in your view, where is the intersection between equity in schools and equity in the broader community, and how do we achieve this connection?
I would say that equity in schools is providing equal resources, supplies, opportunities, support in class and out of class, being treated and disciplined the same. Equity in the communities is confronting the inequalities people see and holding your friends and your neighbors accountable for harmful actions or words. We can achieve this connection by doing both. So basically, if you have like extra resources or extra supplies, donating them to people or providing tutoring or selling prep books, and also holding your teachers and your classmates accountable as well as your friends and your neighbors. So just helping everyone out and using and like sharing your resources with people is definitely a way that we can achieve a connection.
Yeah, Something that I think I learned and a lot of other members, a lot of you can also learn, I mean, probably have learned already too, is that, the school is also part of the community. I think a lot of times, the people in the school go out to the community, or the community is also very involved in school. So if there's an issue or there's already an inequity in school, that's going to affect the community. And that's very clear. We can see with, for example, like the SRO and removing police officers out of school issue. And I think even in steps 2, we see that with the amount of students who are involved in student advocacy. If there's an equity in how many students are involved, then we see that reflected in the community and how much advocacy is going on in an area. So kind of bridging that connection and making sure that there's equity in both the community and in the school.
So one of the intersections between equity in schools and equity in the broader community BGE focuses on is education equity in terms of resource distribution. In context of ESOL students, due to language and cultural barriers, there tends to be a need for much more specified resource support, not only in terms of teachers and educational materials, but also in terms of outreach for activities, where there is a lack in under-resourced and underfunded but overpopulated schools.
Adding on to Sophia, we also believe that those that are provided with the necessary resources they need to succeed in high school, they're going to be in a better standpoint in the future compared to those that don't receive that wealth of resources and that specified support. So the issue of a lack of sufficient resource distribution and thus educational equity, that really affects students' futures in terms of the careers they go to, whether they go to college or grad school, that the resources that they're supported with, that really affects their futures. So in terms of kind of how we achieve this connection between equity in schools and equity in the broader community, really, we've in the past tried to connect with people that directly work with educational inequity and resource distribution, whether that be school principals or coordinators, teachers. We really try to work face to face directly with them, communicate the problem, and just try to work in providing more equitable resources.
Thank you guys for sharing your responses to those questions. This next question is something that I actually talk a lot about with my friends who are engaged in similar social justice activism work, but how has your personal identity affected your work in these organizations or in just the broader context of serving your community?
Yeah, so being Black and being a woman of color and also living in the Downtown County Consortium has definitely affected heavily about the work I do. That's kind of honestly one of the main reasons why I began to get involved, especially around this time, where we saw like a really heavy publicization of the Black Lives Matter movement. That was kind of my stepping stone into getting involved, and kind of that gave me the gateway of uplifting those voices, especially because I knew there's a lot of times where I felt like my voice wasn't uplifted enough. So that's affected and kind of hoping to connect with other people who look like me and making sure that they have that space to, have their voice heard.
I guess for me, kind of, Sophia and I touched upon this a little bit in our presentation, but having experienced language barriers and culture barriers in a different country, and just experiencing what it's like to be an ESOL student, not knowing what your teachers are saying, what your friends are saying, just being surrounded in an unfamiliar environment and community, that's really tough, and it just has a lot of emotional and social aspects to it. So I guess in that terms of having experienced what it's like to be an ESOL student definitely has impacted the work I've done in BGE and has pushed me to further advocate for ESOL students.
I would say my personal identity as a woman, it has definitely impacted my work, because all I want to do is help the other women in my community feel safe through their experiences, and make them feel like they're not alone for the stuff that they have experienced. And also my personal values have definitely helped shape my work, because it's like what I focus on the most, advocating for women, advocating for Black Lives Matter, advocating against hate and stuff like that has definitely is really what brought me to this point, I would say.
Sophia, I know Irene answered, but if you wanted to go as well.
I totally agree with Irene. As I mentioned in the presentation, I was a formal ESOL student, and I had a bunch of family members also in the ESOL program. I remember being in middle school, and like my older cousins actually went to Richard Montgomery, my home high school. And I remember them not knowing what homecoming was, and me kind of like telling them as a middle schooler, I'm like, well, you need to buy a dress for homecoming. Well, fast forward to now, I feel like having that personal experience of having cousins who didn't really know what was going on in school, and me being in ESOL and not really knowing what was going on in school and being out of the loop has definitely impacted what I do now with BGE and with Irene.
You bring up such a good point. I think something that was really shocking for me learning about, just like what ESOL students go through. The craziest thing for me was learning about ESOL isolation, and you really touched on that, like the fact that they don't know what activities are available after school clubs, getting access to homecoming, to the to pep rallies. I mean, that's what makes school fun. Like that's what keeps you in school. And I mean, that's so important for attention anyways. And that speaks to this larger issue of, I mean, it's the education piece, it's the policy piece. So I'm just curious for you guys, what are the most significant obstacles that you face in advocating or organizing around your particular issues? Because, there's so many different pieces of it.
Definitely. Thank you for bringing up that question. One of the most significant obstacles or difficulties we faced in advocating for ESOL students is not a lot of people are familiar with ESOL students, and that kind of links to their lack of interest or passion for advocating for ESOL students. Sophia and I both experiencing what it's like to be an ESOL student, that has made us passionate about advocating for the ESOL community and the immigrant community, as we're both also immigrants. But for people who have not had those experiences, they often tend to not be that interested or that passionate about advocating for ESOL students as much as we are. So kind of one of the obstacles is really garnering interest, making people aware that these are the struggles that ESOL students go through, and these are the accomplishments that they have. Just making people more interested in the issue and the area. I think that's one of the most difficult obstacles that we've gone through.
Yeah, and adding on to what she said, for me and my club, I would say that one of our most significant obstacles is basically feeling like you're not hitting the right target of people who you think should be listening to what everyone has to say. So, we feel like we always tell our club members that the biggest action item that you guys can do for our club is bringing people who you think should listen to what we are saying to our clubs. Because as long as they're there and they're just listening, they don't even have to talk, but they're listening to people's experiences and what they go through in their daily life, and just whatever's going on in the world, they may change how they present themselves and how they like grow as a person, because sometimes when you're talking about all this crazy stuff, but no one and the people who are really causing these issues for women and for people of color and for everyone and people of different religions, they aren't hearing how it's affecting people. So that is kind of something that is definitely a significant obstacle for anybody.
Yeah, so kind of similar to both what Irene and Olivia said, sometimes the biggest obstacle we face in steps too is kind of, making sure it's sometimes not everybody else knows 100% about an issue or exactly what's going on. I think that's the hardest part in trying to educate people about a certain issue or a certain problem. Because sometimes that can hinder your advocacy if not enough people know about it, not enough people care about it, and that's kind of the hardest part. Some ways I guess we've overcome this issue is we created a video series over the summer, really breaking down the boundary analysis and really breaking down the causes and effects of it and really showing it to people in a more digestible way for people to understand, because not everyone's going to want to read a 10-page paper about a certain bill or about a certain issue. So that would be definitely one of the biggest obstacles we faced.
Yeah, I think you guys all brought up really, really wonderful points. I know I can relate to a lot of similar obstacles in my own work. But I think another obstacle that no one really touched on that I'd love to hear from you guys about is the pandemic, right? How has COVID, impacted your work, exacerbated the issues that you're working on? Has it possibly benefited you in some way, right? Like one thing I like to think about is just how I think a lot of work, activism work in particular, has become a lot more accessible now that we're all forced to be online together and learn how to use these digital tools. So I guess as a whole, how has COVID impacted both your work and the causes that you guys are working on?
I would say that COVID has impacted our work because we started our club during COVID, like we built it up during COVID. So it was definitely hard because like sometimes it's hard to reach people because you can't just like walk to a teacher's classroom and be like, hey, I need this, it's like everything is online, which has its pros and its cons. Another thing is we've never been able to meet our members in person besides the people that like we already knew, but like our new members and our freshmen, like we have never actually met them in person. Another thing is that what is good about it sometimes is that everything you can just like send anybody anything and they'll be able to like access it and read it online, whether it's like an Instagram post or an article or a video. And it's definitely given us a lot to talk about because I feel like everything kind of ties back to COVID, like um for inequities like that I've noticed in our areas is like students who get food from the schools and they have to get like computers and Wi-Fi. So that's definitely something that we have been able to help with, like for donations, and everything kind of ties back to COVID. So yeah.
Adding on to Olivia, we've also had just like a bit of a difficulty in getting hold of people we want to work with, not exactly in our team, but ESOL teachers, coordinators, ESOL students. In the past, Sophia and I would visit classrooms physically and we would talk with the teachers, talk with the students, get some feedback on what we've been doing. But because we can't really do that anymore, it's been a bit more difficult to get some advice or some feedback on our work. And also, Olivia also touched upon kind of how they've been able to advocate for certain struggles that students have been going through during COVID. And one of the struggles that ESOL students have been going through during COVID and remote learning is that they're not able to get those important personal connections with teachers. They're not able to get the support and the communication that they need to get. I think Sophia can elaborate a bit more on that point.
So I agree. I think remote learning is hard for, every student. I can't imagine how difficult it would be for ESOL students who are learning academically and culturally in a different language. I was actually talking to a MCPS teacher. Her name is Ms. Shook, and she told me that many students were struggling with the language and the technology with like Zoom in the virtual school.
Yeah, so kind of what everyone said so far and kind of how Hannah mentioned earlier, it's great that well, not great, but COVID has made student advocacy so accessible because we can all meet virtually online and find a time that works for everybody, and we don't have to worry about travel times. But STEPS focuses a lot on equitable education, and unfortunately because of COVID we've seen a lot of the faults in our education system, and how those effects have been exacerbated greatly, as we can see, like lack of mental health resources in a lot of schools, or just the grading policies, and all these are things that unfortunately affect students and unfortunately affect the amount of time they can put into student advocacy because of things like burnout. So those are definitely one obstacle that, or one effect that COVID has had on our group.
I think you all touched on this, but COVID definitely revealed a lot of structural inequalities, really, really deep inequities. So these things that you guys are talking about, seeing such a low retention rate, students not being able to stay in Zoom school. Amari talked about those mental health resources that are so vital now more than ever. And so we're talking about dealing with these systemic inequities, and then you also have those things that crop up as a result of it. Irene was talking about direct action to get at that. So how do you balance those two things? How do you confront surface level inequity while also looking at structural inequity? And I'm just wondering if you all do that in different ways. I'm happy to repeat the question. I know that was very long. So looking at, structural inequities and some of the results of that, like when you're doing direct service, how do you approach those two things differently?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So at least for STEPS, we obviously, we're working really hard on trying to get the boundaries changed in Montgomery County, because obviously that's a big root about the inequity of resources and distribution amongst the county. But kind of some direct action we have been doing is kind of trying to make some of those resources more accessible to our capacity, like having events where we introduce students to other student advocacy groups, and just really opening up our members and kind of telling them different opportunities that they may not have heard of, because those might not be prevalent in their communities, and kind of surface level things like that, while also still combating the deeper issue, which is the boundaries that do need to be changed in the county.
I would say that for surface level issues, for surface level inequity, we usually just try to have a discussion about it, because usually it's it comes up and it's we need to talk about it, so we don't have time to really create a slideshow or do in-depth research that we would do for structural inequity. So that's definitely, I would say there's similar ways that we handle them, because we always want to talk about it, but there's different ways that we go about talking about it. So yeah.
So I would say for surface level inequity, we create posts to spread awareness about inequalities such as microaggressions, name calling, cultural intolerance, and ignorance towards current issues such as immigration reform.
And then, as Sophia has mentioned, while for surface level inequity, there's a lot of focus on spreading mass awareness, and just we tend to target surface level inequity by, through Instagram and through our online presence and platforms by uploading posts, spreading awareness about different issues. But for structural inequity, we tend to focus more on direct interactions, whether that be with staff or admin at schools, or with a different organization, or with an ESOL coordinator. We really try to confront structural inequity through collaboration and various projects. One of the projects that we've been working on is just spreading more awareness about the kind of the system within schools that kind of divide ESOL students within a community, and trying to spread awareness about that issue by uploading stories about ESOL students and immigrant students and how they perceive those issues and how they experience those kinds of inequities at schools and how they feel about it. So we kind of have different kind of approaches to those two levels of inequity.
Thank you. I just want to remind everyone that we are taking audience questions. So we haven't gotten any questions yet, but if anyone has any, just please drop them in the chat or private message them to John. All right. So I think a lot of the causes that you guys, that Avery and I all advocate for, these are things that, you know, adults, professional adults dedicate their entire lives, their entire careers to. But all of us are current students in public school. So there's a real balancing act there, right? So how does the work that you do in these organizations with social justice, with activism, carry through to the rest of your life? And how can you share these experiences with other people?
I would say that what I've like decided based on all of the work that I've done in the past like year of my life is that I want to be a women's studies major. I YCC actually helped me realize this because after the first training, I realized that there are so many ways that you can like go about expanding your activism and like making it more. And so I kind of, yeah, basically I want to be a women's studies major and I want to be a professor for women's studies when I'm older. And so I would say that that is how I can share my experiences, is by using what I've learned so far in high school and like getting involved in all these clubs and organizations like so quickly, and basically like moving that over into like a more professional aspect of my life. So yeah.
Adding on to Olivia, I also really hope, I'm really interested in public policy and I'm also really interested in linguistics studies. So I hope to, when I go to college and when I go through higher education, I would like to major or maybe minor in one of those and just overall become more knowledgeable about how to, on the long-term aspect, support ESOL students. I think, you know, the work that Sophia and I and BG has been doing, it's awesome, it's great, it's really like meaningful and valuable work, but I also want to do more to impact the like just the general ESOL community. I think, you know, as a high school student and as a teenager, sometimes I feel some kind of barriers in being able to achieve what I really want to achieve. So I really want to, you know, in the future, get more education and knowledge about the areas that I'm you know, passionate about and further my advocacy and equity work for ESOL students and immigrant students.
So I hope in college or wherever I, end up going, I can continue advocating for ESOL students and joining, organizations and clubs on campus. In terms of, I feel like anywhere I go, I just want to see, more inclusive environments. And so, yeah.
Yeah, similar to Irene, the work I've been able to do with STEPS, and I've been really interested in policy writing and researching, wherever I go to college, I definitely want to either major or minor in something that can help me do that. But also definitely the work I've been doing, I think has overall just made me look at life in a different lens and seeing unfortunately, all the different inequalities that we have, but make me even more passionate to combat all those inequalities and just make everything more equitable for everyone. And I think that's something that's really nice, is a good lens for everyone to have, because I think you just become a more self-aware person. So yeah.
All such great responses. So, we did talk about the future for you all, and I'm sure this is really inspiring to a lot of people on this call. They're probably wondering, advice for how to get involved into activism and how to get involved politically. I'm especially interested to hear, Amari's response. I know she was saying STEPS was kind of like a gateway for her. But yeah, just really curious, what is your advice for other folks who are interested in getting into that?
Yes, kind of Avery mentioned, STEPS was my my gateway organization into student advocacy. But something I definitely do recommend is, I think, find an issue that you find really passionate about and that you see and that you really want to see change come out of. And I bet you if you type that issue into Instagram, you'll probably find like 30 plus groups that are working on that issue right now. And everyone I've met in like in advocacy in general is honestly super nice and super sweet, and they'll probably be more than happy to have a member to join. So yeah, that's definitely something I recommend that you do. And it's a small stepping stone. At first you kind of feel confused, but always feel free to ask questions, and people are super nice. And yeah.
Adding on, I completely agree with everything that Mari said, but another thing is just find a group of people and stick with them and basically just like add on to your group, because the leadership of my group, the four of us, we do like everything together that involves us like working for change or like creating something. We always do it together because we like support each other through everything. And every time that someone gets a new opportunity, like we always reach out to each other and we're like, let's do this together or something. So definitely finding a group of people that like makes you your best self and is very supportive is like a super good way to get involved, especially because it can get scary and very overwhelming at times. So definitely finding a group of people that you super trust. And another thing is like finding an organization like YCC to really guide you through the process, because after starting my club, which was like it was like the first really big thing that I did to like guide me into like what I do now, like I needed more support from like a really like big group, I guess you could say. So finding something that will help you like be really effective and stuff is really important too. So yeah.
Adding on to Mari and Olivia, I definitely agree that research is definitely important. If you find an issue that you're really interested in advocating for, then definitely do your research. I feel like a lot of people these days, they see something on social media and they're like, I'm really interested in advocating for that. And that's great, but I think it's also great if you can take a further step and research really into that issue and try to find out specifically what you want to advocate for. And like, I believe it was Olivia that mentioned this, but there are a lot of different kinds of advocacy and activism organizations in the world, in the United States, in Montgomery County. So definitely trying to find similar organizations and really just immersing yourself in the work that they do and just doing your research for the area you're interested in advocating for, I think is really important.
I think Olivia mentioned this, but I think it's really important to not be afraid to reach out. I think it's important to talk to the people and the community you're advocating for, but also reach out to, other students who have the same interest as you. And yeah.
Thank you, guys. I really love what Olivia said in particular about finding a community. I think that's always been like the best way to get started for me personally. But it looks like we have 3 questions that have been sent privately to John from the audience. So I can start off with the first one, which is, what were some of the biggest challenges starting these organizations?
I think one of the biggest obstacles or difficulties that Sophie and I faced when we first were thinking of establishing BGE was that creating a strong framework or structure. So Sophia and I were not experienced or knowledgeable about how to create an organization. There really weren't any like guides online that tells you, this is what exactly you need to do. It was kind of like a self-learning process. And so when we first started off, our structure and focus was kind of all over the place. But as time went, we really um, as as time went and we talked with different people, we worked with different organizations, we researched more, we definitely developed a more strong and more cohesive focus and structure.
I would say something that was kind of tough was that it was very overwhelming, especially in my particular case. We had like a very strict deadline that we had to meet if we wanted our club to actually be like an official club at our school. So I was asked to start a branch to YCC, and then I had to find someone to do it with me, and then we basically had to do everything for a club that you need to do to get it started in like 2 days. And we didn't know really what we had to do, so we were kind of just like taking it as people were telling us, like, oh, you need to get this ready, you need to create a Google form, you need to make an Instagram, you need to make a slideshow for this and this. So it was super overwhelming. And I would say that how like our club has changed since then is like now we have like a very like everything that we do now is very different than when we started. So you kind of just have to go along with it and see what happens, because it's never gonna really stay the same. But yeah, it was
Yeah, one of the kind of obstacles we faced in steps when starting up was definitely before we were able to do the YCC training. A lot of us were fairly new to activism, and we had a bit of trouble trying to figure out certain inner loops, kind of things like retention, or best practices for like social media, or best practices for sending emails and things like that. So kind of once we were able to get over that learning barrier of learning how to do all of those things, it fairly became easy, but kind of in the beginning, we struggled with that a bit.
Thank you all so much for sharing. So moving on to our next question from the audience, and this was for Amari. And again, you all can direct questions specifically to a person, but they were wondering, they said Amari mentioned in her presentation that steps to recommendation to distance learning were adopted. So they were just asking Amari if you could talk more about that process and those recommendations.
Yeah, so kind of in steps, we were able to form and build like allyship with adult community members, specifically allies who were sitting on the Board of Education working group, and kind of, telling them our thoughts on like reopening and recommendations that we, as a group of students had. And that really just spoke to volume, kind of how much influence steps was able to build by creating and forming these relationships, and just the power of student advocacy in general, and that the fact that there are adult allies that were listening to us. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Amari, for answering that. And then we have a third question from the audience, and I'll pass it over to Hannah for that one.
Yeah, so someone in the audience wants to know if you guys feel like it's hard to get people to show up to your events, if you struggle with attendance, and what your solutions are for that.
I would say that our first club meeting compared to our most recent club meeting, the attendance is like cut in half. But just know that the people who continue to show up every week, those are the people that you should really be focusing on, because they care and they want to hear what you have to say every week or every other week, and they want to be involved. So there definitely is it can be hard to get people to come to your club, but you just gotta like brush it off when the attendance is lower than usual because people are busy. But the people that do show up, you have to really appreciate them because they're taking time out of their day to listen to what you have to say and be involved with your club. So yeah.
Yeah, for steps, obviously, because, COVID has made, being on Zoom, like burnout is so real and everybody goes through it. And that's definitely, been a big thing that we've kind of struggled with retaining people coming to events. But I think one thing that we've kept in mind too is kind of just always, reaching out to as many people as possible and really like, going to full capacity, emailing teachers, counselors, just anybody who's willing to share information. And also just keeping in mind that, people go through burnout and some people don't just want to join another Zoom meeting or don't want to go on an event. And it's not because they have anything against us. It's probably just because they're zoomed out.
I definitely agree with Mari's point about how some people can be, zoomed out and sick of Zoom, burnt out. We don't really have much to say about attendance because we don't really hold like weekly or monthly meetings, but we do have a lot to say about collaborations. So we also had a bit of like a communication struggle when we were collaborating with different organizations. And what was key to making sure that collaboration ended well was that we kept in contact with the organization. We reached out to them when they didn't submit things for deadlines or when they didn't show up for meetings. And just as Amari mentioned, being aware that some people, they have stuff that they go through that they might not want to talk to you about. And some people are burnt out sometimes and they just want to take a break. So really communication is key, reaching out and making sure that your team members are doing okay, whoever you're collaborating with is doing okay. Just reaching out, and communication in general is really key to keeping everyone in the loop and making sure that your organization flourishes and does well in the future.
Thank you guys so much for your responses. I think if there's one thing I could add to that question, it would just be like, make sure your meetings and your events are things that people want to go to, right? Making sure that it's relevant to what's happening in the world. Like our organizations, our work is not isolated from current events and the news. So incorporating that, if something happens, making sure you have a space to talk about it. But it is 4:15, which is the stated end time of our panel. So thank you guys so much for coming. I learned so much from these three organizations. I really appreciated all of your time and the work that you guys have been putting into our community. I don't know if Avery, you have anything else you want to say?
Yeah, I just want to say, I love this county and just the culture of student advocacy. I think it's really unique that we had 50 people here on this Sunday just listening to these three amazing orgs. Not only do we have you guys doing this great work, but we have community members who are super interested, super involved as well. So yeah, just like really excited to see what you all do. And again, just think about how amazing MoCo is with, that direct action like Irene and Sophia, and then doing some more policy things like Amari and Olivia. So you guys just doing such great things. Thank you for this panel. Thank you so much to you all who came out this afternoon.
Thank you very much, moderators and panelists. Thanks for giving us a great end to our social change conference. If you'd like to get involved with YCC, you can find us on Instagram at kua.ycc. I'll put that in the chat. YCC has monthly trainings for aspiring and current student social justice activists. We also connect activists with up to $20,000 in grant funding, mentorship from experienced social justice activists, adults, and teens as well. And we also foster, I guess, like you could say, fellow to fellow connections too. So we've had a couple of collaborative projects that have come out of our incubator here. Thank you very much. I hope you guys have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your weekend.